We now return to our Institute of Medicine panelists in part 2. Let's pick up with the panelists discussing the report's recommendations.
Thank you very much for inviting both of us here. As Dean Peterson mentioned, the Institute of Medicine has an interesting way, and as you just saw, of bringing diverse people together to attack a social problem or a medical problem. I've been involved with the Institute for a while now in different committees, and it's always a joy when I get to sit next to someone like Bill Purcell, who's being very modest about the role that he played in this committee. I saw from both Mayor Buckhorn and former Mayor Purcell that charm and humor and the ability to engage people and engage your attention is really important, and Bill brought that to the committee, and he is evidencing it here. What's important about this committee is that we came to it to provide and to examine the evidence. And I think I want to underscore that. Maybe that's because I'm a researcher and a social scientist. But that the recommendations that we were looking at were all evidence-based. And that's a really important point to underscore about the Institute of Medicine's reviews. We don't just take opinions or best guesses. If there isn't strong evidence for what we want to do, we move on. So let me begin by talking about the process that we engaged in. We began by compiling a variety of reports, as you can see from this slide, from a whole host of different sectors of the society regarding how to address the obesity crisis. We looked at multi-level, multi-sector, population-based obesity prevention-related, evidence-based recommendations. This comprehensive review that we engaged in reflected recommendations from experts over the past 10 years across the nation that had been convened by government units, by state, local, and national organizations, by a variety of foundations, people in the private sector, and partnerships among these different sectors. To give you a sense of the sources of these recommendations, we've listed a number of them on the slide, and these are just a sampling of some of the recommendations that we looked at. The year 2005 marked the beginning of the IOM's issuance of obesity prevention-related recommendations. That was the year that the first report on the enormity of the childhood obesity crisis was released. And that report and those recommendations demonstrated the complex and multifaceted nature of the many factors that influence energy balance. Since then, there have been a number of reports. In fact, I think that with the APOC, that's what we call the Accelerating Obesity Prevention Report Committee, with the APOC report last May, I believe that IOM has now released something like 10 different reports on obesity. I was a member of the second study committee, which looked specifically at food marketing and its relationship to the childhood obesity crisis that was released in 2006. In addition to the food marketing report, there have been special reports on school foods with recommendations of what kinds of nutritional content and standards should be used in schools, and also on early childhood policies that govern both at home and also in child care centers. The sheer number of these evidence-based recommendations, and we examined about 800 different recommendations that were made over the past decade, reinforces the need for organization and guidance and for focused action. And that was our charge, to try to winnow these down to a set of recommendations that would push and advance the process. All of these recommendations were important steps that made our job possible, but it was not easy. And after reviewing all of them, we came to the conclusion that we had to figure out how to direct all of these efforts. How are we going to proceed? How can we determine what will amplify and what will accelerate progress in a meaningful way? In order to do this, the committee developed and used the guiding principles that are on this slide. We use these to be the sort of guidelines and for our deliberations and for our decisions. Without going into too much detail, these principles highlight that the committee undertook a specific process and used specific criteria to define a recommendation's acceleration potential. For example, potential for high impact, reach, and scope of effects, timeliness, ability to reduce disparities and to promote equity are some of the criteria that we used. Needless to say, the strategies that are not included in the committee's recommendations do not imply that their lack of effect was what we thought of, but it suggests that what we know now, that the evidence the committee believes that we culled, are those recommendations that provide the most promise to accelerate progress over the next 10 years. We believe that the recommendations that we're making are bold actions that have the broadest reach, the greatest potential, and which provide for synergies among the interaction of the different sectors. And I really want to highlight the first guiding principle. We were seeking recommendations that had bold, widespread, and the possibility for sustained action. That this was, I'd say, the highest goal and guiding principle that we gathered. These guiding principles then led into our establishment of and identifying the 5 major goals that we believe sum up the actions that we recommended. That to attack and accelerate obesity prevention, yes. We first need to integrate physical activity every day in every way in people's lives. Second, we need to make healthy foods available everywhere. Third, that we have to begin to market what matters for a healthy life. Fourth, we need to activate employers and healthcare professionals, and we need to strengthen schools as the heart of health. In other words, focused action is needed in these 5 critical areas: physical activity, food and beverage options, the messaging environment, healthcare and work, and the school. The committee then developed 5 recommendations with these goals in mind. For example, for the first goal, the committee's recommendation is that communities, transportation officials, community planners, health professionals, and governments should make the promotion of physical activity a priority by substantially increasing access to places and opportunities for such activity. Then, for each recommendation, the committee also identified somewhere between 3 and 5 strategies that, if acted upon, would have the greatest potential reach and impact on preventing obesity. For example, for the first recommendation, increasing access to places and opportunities for such activity, the strategies for acceleration in this area include, first, enhancing the built environment; second, providing and supporting community programs; third, adopting physical activity requirements for licensed child care centers; and fourth, providing support for the science and practice of physical activity. Then, for each strategy that was recommended, the committee also devised a set of actions that would make likely a positive contribution to the implementation of the strategy based on research evidence. In cases where evidence was lacking or limited, the action steps have a logical connection with the strategy's implementation. For example, again, potential actions to enhance the built environment include developing and implementing sustainable strategies for improving the physical environment of communities, developing and maintaining sustainable strategies to create and enhance access to places and programs, both to encourage physical activity in a safe and an enjoyable way.
One of the, I think, great challenges for policymakers, but it's an equal or greater challenge in some ways for researchers, is not just having the best evidence, but then making a policy decision or recommendation when the evidence may not meet the gold standards that you're used to in proceeding. This was an issue faced in an earlier committee that dealt with trying to create a new evidentiary framework for the purposes of obesity, which some of us believe has other application, but was specifically recommended to you in thinking about obesity. And I recommend this report to you not because I was a member of it, but because I felt very compelled by the complexity of the issue facing each of you, and then the way in which it affected me as a legislator first and then later as mayor. I mean, for you, obviously, ideal science would be, a generation, controlled groups, randomized selections that would allow us over, would you say 20 years, to follow the populations, determine what happens not simply during the life of each of these children and their families, but then see whether or not the results are held over time, what other effects they might have. All of those things, the scientists in this room, the doctors in this room, the public health experts in this room know much more about than I will ever know. But what happens in that context then is a recommendation comes before that, perhaps some would say ideal science. And of course, there are those who are in a position to react to it, to disagree with it. Now, some of that, of course, is in the nature of public policy. I don't know, the Congress might be an example of that. There's one person on one side and one on the other because there's two sides, why not? But in this case, obviously, from a scientific perspective, there's a real ability to test the underlying approach and ultimately conclude that there's not enough evidence to go on. I would say that some might argue this was in part what occurred during the long history of smoking cessation and issues regarding tobacco. And while there are many parallels, I'm not here today to present these two issues as the same. It was a different time and they're different issues. But the reality is that the lack of what was acceptable science at the time tended to allow there to be both delay and confusion about what to do next. And this is particularly complicated for policymakers who don't have scientific backgrounds and are confronted with two doctors who say two different things. Quick example from my own life in the legislature. This is 25 years ago. I remember being confronted is a little strong, not initially approached would be a better word, by an optometrist who said, if we don't implement these reforms within our Optometric Practice Act, there will be blindness from Memphis to Mountain City. Now, I was a new legislator at that time, and I remembered very clearly I had not run on the issue of blindness. I simply hadn't. It was not something that had come up. I was pretty sure that I, if asked, would have said I was utterly opposed to blindness if that was the outcome, but that I didn't think I would be for that, and I really was terribly concerned until an ophthalmologist appeared in my office within a week's time and said, if they pass these initiatives into law here in Tennessee, and I waited, and he said, yes, there will be blindness from Memphis to Mountain City. A policymaker, school board member, mayor, county commission member confronted with that kind of disagreement finds themselves in a very difficult place. And the lead framework that we created is an effort to help assist you and ultimately policymakers in saying it needs to be science-based, as Dr. Wartella made clear.
Clearly.
It has to be. And I acknowledge now as I'm out of office, so I'm sure that if you look back over my time in local and state government, there were occasions when I took action with no science at all. I undoubtedly must have taken action on things there was no basis for. I can remember distinctly when we made the zebra swallowtail the state butterfly of Tennessee. I had no scientific reason for choosing the zebra swallowtail. It was simply the butterfly that was presented to us, and it is today the butterfly of Tennessee. So there are moments when you're going to act upon, I frankly cannot identify this butterfly, but it is our butterfly. I know that much because I voted for it. But on important things like the lives of our children and the lives of our people and the welfare and well-being of our community, quite clearly there ought to be not just a reason, but a basis and one upon which we have a high level of confidence. So the LEAD framework was an effort, and I hope and believe a successful one that I, again, suggest you might take a look at, to help policymakers understand that we are proceeding now with the best evidence we have and with a reasonable certainty that this evidence and this approach will direct us to improved results. And we are, as Dr. Wartella made clear, reasonably satisfied that it will not have negative or other effects. And the other thing I will tell you is not science in this report at all. It was science from Harvard during the time that I was there. It's about 2 years ago, and if you're interested in the citation, I will be happy to give it to you later, by a couple of researchers who looked at people, not just in this setting, but in a wide variety of settings, and found that people, irregardless of what they are doing, there's one exception, but it's not relevant for this purpose, almost irregardless of what you're doing, your minds, the minds of people wander about half the time. Actually, I knew this just by looking at you. You've been better than most audiences that I've seen in not actually pulling out your iPads and pretending to take notes while you're actually surfing the web. You've been very good about that.
That sounds like the students in my class.
I was thinking of the students in my class who appear to be very carefully noting my every word when I really know they're talking to their moms. But so you knew that was true, but what the research went on to find actually is that people who are able to keep their minds from wandering are happier people. And again, I can't say that this has gone through the LEAD framework or any others, but it was pretty compelling evidence, and I recognize that this is a really long session that we are engaged in. We hope to have time at the end, and I'm sure we will, for questions. And since we started a little early, I'm going to encourage you to believe that we will probably end a little early too, which will give you a chance to check in with your moms and find out what's going on in the rest of the world. If so, while I think I can, from the science, say you will be happier, from my experience, I think it is likely, particularly if you listen to Ellen, that you will be smarter as well. We lead the recommendations in the area of physical activity. All 5 of these recommendation areas are equal, I think, in the minds of the committee. This is not a particular order of importance, but I can say, as a person who comes from government and from particularly local government, it meant a lot to me that we led with this recommendation of physical activity, because it is an area in which, quite frankly, a lot of us, a lot of mayors, a lot of citizens, a lot of folks have been trying to change the course of our development. And now there is a very good scientific reason to do those things that many of us already wanted to do. The recommendation says that, and this is broad because, again, the charge is on us all, the communities, transportation officials, and community planners, health professionals, governments, I think that's everybody, should make promotion of physical activity a priority by, and this was the strongest word we could use at this point, substantially increasing access to places and opportunities for such activity. The hard, stark, underlying statistic is that less than 20%, 19% only, of Americans get the recommended amount, not the marathon amount, not the super amount, not the amount the mayor participated in just this weekend, but this basic amount recommended, and we're running at less than 20% for that number, for that requirement. The strategies in this case are broad, but I think very tangible and easily connected, not just to what we're doing, but to what we want to do. We start by saying that we need to, let me give you one quick footnote here. The specific recommendations for schools are not included within this set of recommendations. The schools section is the 5th, and you will find, and we'll talk about the recommendations for school PE and physical activity in that area. This then is for everybody. This is for all of us, the people in this room, our families, the people with whom we work. And it starts with the notion that we need to focus on the built environment. We need to focus on the built environment in our cities, in our towns, in our counties. And I will say, for me, it is a lot of remembering what we used to know, as well as implementing those things that we've learned about what we can do in our cities and towns. We understood at one time about the need to provide safe places to walk. The word sidewalk was not an unusual word in America in places large and small. It was an innovation, an enhancement that a town that was developing and growing added because they knew that was a sign not just of development, but ultimately of success. And the notion of sidewalks was, as we know, in much of America forgotten. And certainly in newer places believed to be unnecessary. And it goes beyond that to bike lanes and greenways and spaces and places to be outside in. There is a great, I think, demand for this now. And we find, particularly as we're encouraging folks to relocate to our cities or stay within our counties, that these are the kinds of things they are looking for. But I don't underestimate the complexity of it either, particularly when you're trying to do that thing which we don't have. Bike lanes is an example that comes to mind. People argue, those who believe this is not important, that there is no one on the bike lane, for example, at the start. Well, there's no one on the bike lane because we didn't have one, and actually they can't remember where they left their bicycle because it's been so long since there was a bike lane. It goes on from there. Finally, in Boston, Mayor Menino decided to get on his bike and begin riding around Boston on his own bicycle. He was hit by a car. That particular program didn't work very well. So he moved out and brought bicycles into the city, now something fairly common across all of America. There will be resistance, very practical political resistance to changes and transformations of the built environment. The list is long, and you know it. But at the heart of it, it is focusing our attention again on the built environment to be sure that people have the ability to be outside, in parks, in areas that are available to them, and then I will add, that are safe. Because the other piece of it is, it just won't work. If you have a sidewalk or a park, but a parent, a wise parent, a cautious parent, says you can't go out and play. That thing we did growing up, go out and play and don't dare come home before it gets dark. Or we put it another way, our mothers did, didn't they? They said, you need to come home before dark. But it was really, you need to stay out until dark and then come home and give me a break. That basic notion that tied so much of us to the fabric of our communities and towns and areas obviously has been lost, not just because of changes in the built environment, but because of societal changes that have to be a piece of remembering what we knew. Second, pretty simple, pretty straightforward, not easy, but within your charge and mine. We need to do everything we can to encourage physical activity then by, again, everybody. We have to have programs, and I was delighted to hear the report on Hillsborough County and the number of things that are being done here right now, but I will emphasize now and later on. This is work that is constant, it's ongoing, and it's forever, actually. Because again, we understood much of this in the past and implemented and thought we had it embedded, and it wasn't. So at the end of the day, we need just not new initiatives, but a basic commitment to keeping physical activity at the front of people's minds at all ages, in all places, in all ways. And that needs to be not just the government itself, but organizations represented here and more broadly across the county and the state and the nation. And that involves promotion campaigns, obviously, with high visibility delivery channels, multiple sectors of influence, strategies that not simply says you need to do it, but then explains and shows how you do it, how you can do it, how it fits within your daily life, how it can be a part of what you're already doing. None of us has the time to do, I don't know, anything that we have to do, but we end up doing those things that we absolutely need to do. And so to have this at a basic inculcated in a way that people understand, you have to do it. You just do. And actually, much like the research I showed earlier, we know in essence that when you do it, you are happier and more successful as a family, as a person, and ultimately as a community. The third strategy in this area focuses on licensed child care providers, and that's another area where the Head Start report, first thing, top of today, was an encouragement to me. But obviously we know that while we have thousands of young people in Head Start in this city and region, and obviously in each of across the country, there are an awful lot of other children who are in licensed and other kinds of settings in child care. And this is one of those early lessons that needs to be learned. And obviously, while there are many things that young people can call out for, this takes adult direction, understanding, and commitment. And that, I think, is not simply by those who are in the setting itself, but by the families who are utilizing the setting to understand what needs to happen and how it should happen. Basically, we believe that the data is clear, that there should be free and structured play at a rate of roughly 15 minutes per hour of care during the day. In these areas, obviously, we might disagree about particular guidelines or guideposts. At the heart of what I think the committee recommended was the need to be sure that there were, in fact, guideposts. The last piece here is a strategy that simply and straightforwardly says we have to focus on the science and practice of physical activity. There needs to be more research across the board. There needs to be more accounting and data collected across the board. But particularly in the area of physical activity and exercise, we think that there needs to be an enhanced governmental support for further research at every level. And we can't say that strongly enough, particularly at this time when budgets are constrained, all budgets, especially research budgets. It is the kind of thing we do classically. We protect the front line, but in this case, over the long term, if we're going to defeat an epidemic, we need to keep track of what we're doing and what's working and share it with the world in ways we never have before, or risk, obviously, living this not just for our lives, for generations to come.
And I should point out that the IOM just recently released a report on physical activity that I think it came out this past fall that makes a variety of specific recommendations that you might want to look at. Let me move on. The second recommendation had to do with the food and beverage environment, and it specifically wants to address the kinds of foods and beverages that are available to the population. The recommendation says that governments and decision makers in the business community and private sector, so it's both public and private, should make a concerted effort to reduce unhealthy food and beverages and substantially increase healthier food and beverage options at affordable and competitive prices. The business community and private sector includes in this descriptor private employers and privately owned and or operated locations frequented by the public. In fact, our chair, Dan Glickman, was really insistent that we examine and refer to places like movie theaters and shopping centers, sporting and entertainment venues, bowling alleys, and other sort of recreational areas, that we not just think about government buildings or school buildings or the community centers, that we think broadly about where food and beverages are available. The other point I want to make about this recommendation is that while there may be no consensus on the definition of unhealthy foods and beverages, the term here refers to the sorts of food and beverages that are calorie dense and are low in nutrients. Just as an aside, I can remember when I was sitting on the study committee on food marketing in 2005 and 2006, we had a number of public hearings, and at every one of them, we had people come to us and tell us there's no such thing as a healthy or an unhealthy food. And the conversation about what kinds of foods are healthier for you has changed drastically in the interim 8 years. We now do know that there are sorts of foods that have the kind of high calorie, high fat, high sugar, high salt content that are simply not healthy and are contributing to obesity. So while we don't argue that there are healthy foods, we know that there are healthier foods for you. And these are the foods primarily recommended in the dietary guidelines for Americans, and we want to reduce the unhealthy foods that can lead to obesity. The food and beverage strategies that we recommend are 5. The first one I particularly want to note is to adopt policies and implement practices to reduce overconsumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. We believe that decision makers at all levels, and most especially at community levels, are important in adopting comprehensive strategies to reduce the overconsumption of, in particular, sugar-sweetened beverages. And I know that you're aware that over the last several years, it's been the sugar-sweetened beverage product that's been the focus of a lot of community actions and regulations, such as the one that Mayor Bloomberg enacted this last year of reducing the size of the cups that you can buy sweetened beverages in. Sugar-sweetened beverages are defined in this report and generally to include all beverages containing added caloric sweeteners, including but not limited to sugar or otherwise calorie-sweetened regular sodas. Something that's less than 100% of fruit drinks, energy drinks, sports drinks, and ready-to-drink teas and coffees. We recommended, in addition to adopting this policy, is that healthier food and beverage options be provided, and that we, in Strategy 3, use strong nutritional standards for all foods and beverages that are sold or provided through the government. The action steps that go along with these strategies include that at school locations where children are cared for, that we should ban sugared sweetened beverages, that we should make clean, potable water available and provide a variety of beverages recommended by the DGA. And across school systems across the nation, there have been attempts to take sugar-sweetened beverages out of the schools and replace them with water and other healthier drinks. We also recommended that in the business, private sector, the government sector, and non-governmental agencies, that water be available in all public places, that the variety of beverage options competitively priced should be priced at a point that incentivizes people to choose the healthier option. And there was some, and quite a lot actually, discussion about how we could encourage this by potentially taxing sugar-sweetened beverages, where that tax that was leveled and collected would then be used for obesity prevention programs. We also recommended that both the private sector and the government sector develop social marketing and education campaigns. And I want to highlight that issue again, too. In the 2006 Food Marketing Report on the relationship between food marketing and obesity, the one recommendation out of about, I think it was 7 that we made, the one recommendation that has never been adopted was to develop a public-private partnership directed at new parents, particularly new mothers, to teach them about nutrition and how to move their children at very early ages. We used to say about 1 or 2, but now we're talking about 4 months, 5 months, 6 months, to take them on a trajectory of healthy eating. I know when I was a new mother that for those first few months, my pediatrician would talk to me about how my sons were doing in terms of what they were eating and moving from nursing to solid foods. But after they reached about 1 year of age and they were eating solid foods, we never talked about their food or how I would provide a nutritious environment for them. And so this campaign, which is the only recommendation that hasn't been adopted at all from that 2006 report, I think is still a very important recommendation to put on the table, and that's part of what we're asking for here. Another set of action steps have to do with industry, and we're recommending that the industry, particularly the food and beverage industry, develop and promote a range of beverage options, including the development of healthy options with reduced sugar content and smaller portion sizes. I have to say, I had never heard of the Take Half Home program before. I love it. I think that is a terrific program, and congratulations to you for adopting it. There were also action steps that we recommended for healthcare providers. And there, our recommendation was that they screen for excess consumption of sugared sweetened beverages and counsel on all health risks associated with those. If I could make another addendum, since this report has come out, sugared sweetened beverages have been noted by nutritionists and other people who've studied this area that they probably are the largest single contributor to overeating and excess calories. More recently, and since this report, a variety of researchers have begun to look at another food area that is very high in children's diets, and that's pizza, and which it is the #1 choice preference for children in elementary schools. The average American child eats at least pizza once a week, and while we think of it as potentially healthy, it is high in fat and it's high in calories, and it's an area that we need to think about as another food that we perhaps should begin reducing in our children's diets. The other strategies, the third strategy about increasing the nutritional standards, finding financial incentives and zoning strategies. There have been some attempts to look at least the messaging and the availability of foods in different areas. And lastly, to examine the effects of the U.S. agricultural policies on diets and obesity. And there was much discussion in this committee about how USDA and our agricultural policies influence eating. What we noted when we were doing the report was that it was not a standard practice for Congress to send the proposed agriculture bill over to Health and Human Services for its review. And I do want to note that this fall, this was the first time that that has happened, so that agriculture policy can become aligned with policies regarding health and obesity prevention. Let me move on to the third recommendation. This is the slide about the message environment, and the recommendation specifically is that industry, educators, and government should act quickly, aggressively, and in a sustained manner on many levels to transform the environment that surrounds Americans with messages about physical activity, food, and nutrition. And as you heard, I am a communications researcher, and so this is one of the areas in which I have particular interest in what that message environment provides. The first strategy in the message environment is that Congress, the administration, and other federal policymakers and foundations should dedicate substantial funding and support to the development and implementation of robust and sustained social marketing program on physical activity and nutrition. And the thought here is that this program should encompass carefully targeted and culturally appropriate messages aimed at specific audiences, such as the tweens, new parents, new mothers, and adolescents. That there should be clear behavior change goals, that it's not just enough to say eat well or exercise, but to make recommendations such as take a daily walk, drink fewer sugared sweetened beverages, talk to mothers about how to introduce vegetables to their infants, and to make use of new sorts of front-of-pack nutrition labeling. Also, we recommended that there be related environmental change goals that be articulated and specified, such as trying to improve the physical environments, offer better food choices in public places, and increase the availability of healthy food retailing. The second strategy had to do with implementing common standards for marketing foods and beverages. And here, the issue is, can we develop nutritional standards for all foods marketed to children that meet certain nutritional guidelines for healthy eating and healthy nutrition practices? In 2009, 4 different agencies of the federal government came together in what was called the Interdepartmental Working Group to establish and to make recommendations about such nutritional standards. The group was headed by Bill Dietz, who at the time was at the Center for Disease Control and head of their food and nutrition area. Those recommendations that were first made public in December of 2009 were then reviewed over the next year throughout 2010 and a variety of settings within the industry. And finally, in 2011, the FDA and USDA made public some recommendations that would be voluntary, not required, but voluntary recommendations on what should be the nutritional standards for marketing to children. And by marketing, they meant the kinds of foods that might be marketed on television, which is still the #1 medium that children in this country attend to, but also could be used in other venues. There were government hearings in the fall of 2011 in which the industry came and talked about some of these standards and their concerns about beginning to set standards in the arena, particularly in television. But the recommendations went forward. They were put out for review by USDA and FDA. They were examined, and not for review to make policy, but examined. And they moved on into the White House, which is where they sit right now. And we're waiting to see when we might be able to get such nutritional standards recommended. I want to highlight that those, the IWG recommendations are not recommendations that would be required for marketing to children, but they would be recommended. Since then, many of those standards have been reviewed by industry self-regulatory groups and by the broadcast networks and some of the other cable channels, with some claims that they will begin to adopt them. One company, for instance, is Disney. And Disney has announced early on that they would have more nutritional offerings at their parks, but they also have announced that on their television channel, which is very popular with kids, that they will begin to enact policies to only promote healthier, more nutritious foods in the marketing on the Disney Channel. So while the IWG hasn't been adopted widely, those standards are now being scrutinized in a variety of venues to bring about, in some cases, industry self-regulation to raise the nutritional standards of foods marketed to children. The third strategy has to do with the FDA and USDA implementing a standard system of nutrition labeling for the front of packages and retail store shelves. By way of information, on the front of pack committee, which was the Institute of Medicine committee that made such recommendations for nutritional labeling on the front of all packaged foods in the United States, the committee that I chaired actually released its report about a year ago now, a year and a half ago. The report went to the USDA and FDA. I know you all know this. USDA regulates foods that have meat in it, and FDA regulates the other foods that don't have meat in it. When we made our recommendation, which in brief was that any sort of front-of-pack label should include a very quick symbol that would be recognized easily. And we were thinking there in our analogy of the Energy Star system, that if you see an Energy Star, an electrical appliance, you know that it's safe and is energy efficient, that there should be such a simple symbol. And we asked that the FDA actually do some consumer research to let us know what sort of symbol we would need, whether it should be a check, or it should be stars, or it should be something. And that on the front of pack, there should be calories per serving should be prominently displayed. And then there should be the symbol, a check mark, to say whether the product per serving met acceptable standards of fat, salt, and sugar amounts. And then those checks, when you turned over, this front of pack information would be harmonized with the back of pack nutritional label, so that the check would be next to wherever the appropriate level of fat, salt, or sugar was. The recommendation for this system is sitting, as I said, at the USDA and FDA, and we did ask them to conduct some research, consumer research on this areas, and our hope is that within the next several years, we'll begin to see some sort of common, easily understood front-of-pack nutrition labeling system. Congress asked for that committee, the Front of Pack Committee, because a variety of different food companies, such as Kraft and others, and different grocery store chains were developing different symbol systems with different standards. Also, which could become confusing to the consumer. Also, about a month before our Front of Pack labeling report came out, the industry, the Grocery Manufacturers Association, adopted its front up, Nutrition Up Front, I think it is, program, which has not been widely adopted in the industry, but it was a little bit more specific with lots more information about the nutrients that are in the front of packaged foods. So that nutrition labeling system is moving forward, and the hope is that the American consumer will soon have a quick and easily understood guidance by looking at packaged foods on what are the more nutritious foods and the more nutritious brands within a competitive food area. And the last strategy that was recommended was that the USDA should adopt and update policies for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, education, and the policies for other federal programs with nutrition education components to explicitly encourage the provision of advice about types of food to reduce in the diet consistent with dietary guidelines for Americans. And through some other areas, I know that USDA has contracted for research in this area of SNAP recipients to see how to encourage them to eat healthier foods and to choose healthier foods in the environment, and what sorts of messages should be used.
In this area, I think there was concern within the committee, but I think in the world at large about social marketing campaigns, what they can do, what difference can they make, and which causes your mind, I think, to turn to previous social marketing campaigns and think them through and what's worked here and across the country. When I think of these kinds of campaigns, I grew up with the phrase, buckle up for safety. When I say buckle up for safety to this day, that jingle begins to play in my head, and now that I have reminded you of it several times during the course of today, you will find yourself just happily to yourself, hopefully, singing, buckle up for safety, buckle up. Buckle up for safety, everybody, buckle up. It'll happen to you. Well, it's just, maybe it's just me, but does anyone else remember that particular campaign and that jingle? It was incredibly successful in one way in delivering a message. On the other hand, as we all know, it took a lot more activity to actually push those seatbelts to the point, as we heard earlier today, where kids were demanding, as my child did, as I'm sure yours did as well, that not just that you buckle up, but that you buckle up fast and early and be locked in. It took a sustained effort. And in most of these kinds of campaigns, there wasn't anything on the other side arguing that you shouldn't buckle up, right? There wasn't a just forget it campaign going on, just live free and die while you're driving campaign. That wasn't going on. There was not, so as you think about the social marketing campaign, know that we recommend it. We believe it's necessary. I don't think there's any chance over time, and this is my personal opinion, that in terms of actual investments in these areas, that the dollar figures will be comparable around these issues. Having said that, it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't pursue it. We think it's required, necessary, and because of the imagination and the insight and the connection that you have to your own communities, there's the opportunity, I think, that you can make the case in a way that will surprise even you. At the end of the day, meetings like this are a part of that as well, but as you'll hear later on, and as I hope you're inclined to do already, it's going to take activity all the time from now on. Fourth set of recommendations are in the area of healthcare, insurers, and work sites. And once again, I'm going to commend Hillsborough County and the organizers here because we touched on this right at the top. You had elected officials beginning with the notion that they feel an obligation to their own employees, but it was delivered in a way, I thought, in particular by Ken Hagan, that he felt an obligation for that kind of information to spread out into the larger workplace. The heart of the recommendation is that healthcare and health service providers, employers, and insurers need to increase their entire support structure for achieving better health and obesity prevention activities. You know, that, again, you look at the stat, a quarter of your life is spent in a room like this, sitting like this, which I note actually probably reduces skin cancer greatly, and is undoubtedly your UV protection here is quite strong, and I hadn't thought about it in a Florida context, but at the end of the day, sitting in a room like this reminds you that there's much more that we can and should do as employers. And we begin with the notion that we need to have from our healthcare providers standards of practice, which can either be evidence-based or consensus guidelines for the prevention, the screening, the diagnosis, and treatment of overweight and obesity to help children, adolescents, and adults maintain a healthy weight, to help them avoid the complications that come from obesity, and then to reduce the psychosocial consequences of obesity. And we think that healthcare providers ought to feel the obligation, that would be many of you, to advocate on behalf of all of their patients, all of their clients, for improved physical activity and diet opportunities within the community itself. So it falls to all of us not to be completely responsible, but to feel a connection to the need for change in this area. At the end of the day, their patients, your patients, need you. These are things they cannot do alone. And your leadership, your position in the community, and your scientific arguments for them will make a significant difference. Second strategy in 4.2 is for insurers directly, both public and private insurers, to require that health insurance coverage and access provisions address obesity. Not just treatment, but prevention as well. We think it's good health. We believe it's good business as well. Third is dealing with work sites, but it can be all of those places where we gather. They need to create, expand, and provide healthy environments by not just establishing policy, but frankly the opportunity to exercise. And again, I was pleased to hear specifically here in Hillsborough County what government is doing. But there are lots of other things that employers can think through. In a recent experience of my own, I'm on the 18th floor of a building, and I thought, inspired of course by my work with Ellen and others, that it was time to walk down the stairs, not all 18 flights, but I could walk down 2 levels, no need to take the elevator. And I don't know, I may be revealing something about my own lack of foresight, but of course I got down 2 floors and was sealed up inside I was just sealed up inside the building. I don't really know where I was, but I couldn't get off the floor. I knocked on the door. No one would let me out. I was just trapped, and I was now 16 floors above the ground. I didn't know whether I wanted to go back up, totally unsure that my own coworkers would let me in. I was really stumped for a time there in this sort of dark space inside of a skyscraper in Nashville when I concluded that I might retrace my steps, find the door that I came out of, and perhaps my cell phone would summon someone who would not tell everyone what I just told you, that I had locked myself into the inside of my building. You know, there's lots of spaces like that we built in a different time, in a different way, and lots of ways that employers, as they're thinking about the way in which they're going to rethink their own spaces, to provide opportunities for activity throughout the day that will not only allow you when you want to do it, but encourage you to do that very thing. There's much more in this area to be done, and I think everyone in this room understands that very well. And the last area really is directed to health service providers, but as I think an educator, but ultimately to employers, and their need to do everything they can to promote wellness during pregnancy of their employees and of their clients within the community. The population disparities, particularly in breastfeeding, need to be addressed to remove barriers. We know that primary prevention begins before birth. The great thing about public health is that that's a social marketing campaign that you all have been pursuing for a generation and continue to pursue. But I think it's now time to make sure that the message of the advantages of breastfeeding after birth, obviously, continue that prevention and are an important public health strategy, but an important strategy for employers to understand and support and provide. And there's much more to be done in that area. Plenty of good research on it and much more to be accomplished. In the last set of recommendations, we deal with schools. So half of children's waking hours, and that's a rough statistic because obviously lots of kids are not getting enough sleep. But as we look at the way in which their day goes, you need to keep in your heads, I think, that if they were sleeping as they should, it's half their day is inside of school. What we say in this report and believe is that our schools can be the heart of health and should be. And at the start of that, let me be very, very clear that we are also much informed by many is a little imprecise, by 2 or more generations of America saying, let the schools handle it, whatever the particular issue was in public health. And there were some brilliant strategies around schools involving polio, for example. But by and large, the idea of the schools handling every social and health problem that we had was asking too much, providing too little, and overburdened the very system that we were counting on to help us through it all. So there is nothing in this report, and no one should leave this room believing that we think that by saying that schools should be at the heart of health, that somehow that makes them the lead or makes them solely responsible, or anyone in that committee believed that they could do it alone, any more than we believed that a governor could do it alone, or a mayor could do it alone, or a first lady could do it alone, or an employer could do it alone. Throughout this report, we make clear, and I hope throughout today, we've said, as we hope you will to others, this is an area in which we all have a role, and we all have to play it. And if we don't, we won't be successful. So when we look then at the school strategies, we begin with PE. Recognizing that everything the schools do is central, in this area we think it is critical, and we also start, at least I will say, we start by with the premise, and let me back up, because schools is the one area that I found as mayor, and I'm sure school board members do too. This is the one area in public life where everyone is an expert. Everybody knows exactly what the schools should do because, well, you know, they went to school. Their kids went to school. Their grandchildren are in school. I mean, they're just an expert. They know what worked for them, they think. Now, granted, why we think our memories are so much better 30 years later in this particular area than they are in most other areas, I don't have a clue. But in this, I acknowledge that people believe they are experts, and about this, they don't know what they need to know. Most people believe, for example, that we must have school nurses in all our schools. You know, they think that. It's not true. They think it. They must be providing health care of a type they remember, many of them, from their own schools. And lastly, most people believe that they're gym teachers as there always were, that PE is occurring as it always was, that kids are dressing out and going through the process that they themselves remember from youth, and everyone in this room knows it ain't so. It's not occurring in that way. And again, very front of mind for people in the field, that we would start with the notion that the mandate was removed, that the focus on testing moved us away from the balance that we thought we understood should be a part of life. This committee is very clear, and this report is very straightforward, that schools should require quality physical education and the and is I think is central to this as well, and opportunities for other physical activity in school. And the specific recommendation we make here is that in grades K through 12, there should be opportunities to engage in 60 minutes of physical activity per school day. Now, that's not 60 minutes of PE. You heard me and understood it, but let me just emphasize, no one is suggesting that that has to be a block of time now carved out of educational time or added on. But the idea that within a school day we could, as a rough measure, have 60 minutes of some kind of physical activity, particularly, again, back to people's memories, they believe that recess is occurring as it always occurred. The kids, again, just to go out and play, well, we know that must be, and it's not. It's not happening. In many schools, there isn't a space or an opportunity for recess to be taken. Other obligations have been placed upon the schools. Rather than focus on that, focus on the positive need to once again understand what kids need, what the data and the science shows, and that schools can insist that during the course of the day, we're going to make sure that our kids have the opportunity for 60 minutes of physical activity, and we're going to make sure that happens in every school within the district.
The second strategy, which recommends to ensure that strong nutritional standards for all foods and beverages that are sold or provided through schools be adopted. And I must say that that is a strategy that's taking place around the country. The committee specifically recommended that schools should look at the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, 2010 guidelines. And if these were to be adopted, which are guidelines to ensure healthy diets for children and adolescents, that there would be increasing amounts of fruits, vegetables, high fiber grains consumed in the schools, and decreasing amounts of consumption of sugared sweetened beverages, dietary fat in general, solid fats, and added sugars. And that there would be more attention to ensure that the portion sizes of meals and other foods and beverages are adjusted appropriately for children. The committee also felt that federal, state, and local decision makers are really responsible for ensuring that these nutrition standards are adopted, and that in partnership with families and parents and teachers and regulatory agencies, they're also responsible for ensuring that these standards are adhered to and monitored so that we can be aware of how the schools can become this sort of focal point, and that good, healthy, nutritional food options and beverage options within schools is kind of at the center, as Bill said, to trying to fight this obesity crisis. The third strategy had to do with also recommending that there be age-related, grade-related, ongoing nutrition education in American schools that would span the grades from kindergarten through 12, and it would be based on food and nutrition recommendations in the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. There was much discussion about how long it's taken in many communities across the country to add new things into the curriculum. We understand that the public school system is concerned when we begin to add a lot of new things. Many school systems over the last 10 years have added media education as a recognition that media are now such an important part of not just children's lives, but all of our lives, and that they need to become media literate. And the argument here is that the understanding and acquisition of good practices about nutrition are equally important in the healthy development of children and adolescents, and that nutrition education should be put on the table as one of those areas in which we could increase understanding, learning, and hopefully move children and adolescents into appropriate dietary practices. In addition to these various evidence-based recommendations and strategies, and we've gone over the 5 basic areas, there are other critical components to advancing and accelerating obesity prevention. It's not just putting the 5 areas on the table, but that if you adopt a systems approach, you recognize that these various components are interrelated, and we needed to address that issue. We were concerned that we achieve equity across a variety of groups in the society to ensure that all groups were represented and could be addressed in the obesity prevention areas, that we adopt considerations for how to engage and mobilize for change across the various sectors of the community, and that we needed to talk about the important role that inspirational leadership in a community, in a school, at the state level, at the federal level, and various sectors that are involved, that leadership was important to accelerate these changes. Together, our belief was that accelerating progress in obesity prevention needed to adopt a sort of systems approach. I think Dean Peterson mentioned that these things are interrelated, that you can't just work on one goal or in one sector and achieve success. You needed to adopt an approach that looked at multiple sectors. And so we took a systems approach, and this was a model, a visualization of how the committee's guiding principles, goals, strategies, and action steps are interrelated. It was a conceptual tool that the committee used to look at the recommendations simultaneously and to guide our deliberations in identifying, selecting, and mapping the various action steps, recommendations, and strategies that we recommended. Now, I think this all works. These gray boxes are the recommendations, the 5 areas that we have, and the colored circles are the 20 strategies. The colors represent the different sectors of society required for successful implementation: the public sector, the business sector, the private sector, healthcare, work sites and employers, and citizens and civic organizations. The evidence that was utilized for the committee to identify the recommendations in implementing strategies and actions includes basic research as well as practice-based science or implementation research. We noted that the evidence supporting the recommendations and actions in this report came a very long way over the 10 years of IOM looking at the problem. And we hoped that by this mapping system and of the various levels of recommendations in the report, that we would be able to focus the attention of decision makers and different sectors in the society to begin to examine what they needed to do to accelerate obesity prevention.
May I make a comment before you move on?
Yeah.
I think for the scientists in this room, I'm convinced that this is a very helpful way to think about all of this, and that it is absolutely the way both people in public health and medicine should consider both the present and the changes we're recommending. But I will acknowledge that for a policymaker and for others in the room, this was a reminder of why I never wanted to be an electrician. So I don't think, if you're having that feeling, you don't have to feel bad. I think you just know there's some more slides to come and it'll get better.
This is a much easier slide to understand. And the whole point is that the connections among the 4 major areas, or 5 major areas, the message environment surrounds all these others, is that these are interacting and connected realms in which we are making recommendations, and that you can't just achieve success in one realm and expect that you'll achieve success overall, that action is required in all the sectors, the business community and private sector, the public sector, in citizens and civic organizations, in healthcare and work sites, and in employers, and in the schools. And that's the whole point of this slide. And there's another representation of it. That's you.
And once again, I think that those who spoke before us, to our delight, recognized and touched on the issues that were at the core of concerns of the committee. And while the mention was in passing today, everyone in this room understands that there are huge challenges in achieving equity in a wide variety of areas of concern here. Certainly, as we look at schools and education, we are much focused on the disparity in numbers, but in this particular set of concerns as well, we have to keep the issue of equity front of mind, and that's what the committee asks each of us to do, that the environmental and other conditions which contribute to obesity end up resulting in a disproportionate effect upon different populations within our community, especially in racial and ethnic minorities, and especially in low-income populations. Now, there are those who would focus there alone. There are those who would say, given the numbers, that's where the resources need to go. I think the committee took the position, and I personally would say, that it is a problem that affects us all, and as a result, we have the greater opportunity to make the changes we need to make if we keep focused on the whole community and what we must do. But having said that, no one should ever lose sight of the fact that there are particular effects in every one of these recommendations that are going to require extra effort by us to overcome the hurdles and save those children. And again, in the area of the physical and built environment, we can do everything known to make a safe playground from a physical standpoint, but if the neighborhood isn't safe, that playground isn't going to be used, that playground isn't going to be making the difference that we want it to make. That goes for green spaces in general, and sidewalks and playgrounds, all of the places and areas in which we would want these children to be and families to be will be passed by if the distance, if the space between school and home and church or place of worship is not perceived and is not safe for those kids. We can spend all day talking about, and for some of you it must feel as though we have already, talking about good food, the dietary guidelines, what we ought to do, whether or not pizza, and I did not know about the pizza research that Ellen just mentioned, and I am certainly hopeful that it's not going to turn out to be anything other than a health food, but that's just...
Sorry.
That's all right, that's all
not.
right. I mean, again, I'm not the scientist, so I keep holding out hope that butter might turn out to be a health food, but it's probably less likely. Pizza, at least there's no hard data yet. But you can talk about this food in any way you want. But if it's not available, if you can't get there, if it can't get to you, it's not going to happen. We can talk about the psychology of children and the best ways in which to present green beans. And I have sat through a rather scintillating discussion of green beans and improving. In fact, at least some of the last meeting we had. I told my wife, they said we should have put honey on it. Then she would have liked the green beans. I eat green beans, and I'm okay on green beans. But if they aren't there, if they aren't available, it won't matter. And so we all know, I think mayors increasingly, but public health communities are looking at both short-term and long-term solutions. Short-term solutions can obviously involve mobile food programs. Gardens, which I know Tampa and other places are emphasizing, are all positive. But at the end of the day, the recommendations tell us that we've got to look at those things that are going to make permanent differences throughout the year. It's swell to talk about farm fresh food from local farms, and I'm there. I'm all over that idea. But at least in my community, it doesn't do you a lot of good in January. It doesn't do you a lot of good in February. You've got to focus on ways in which to transform both the built environment and the physical environment and the availability of these foods for people, especially in low-income neighborhoods. Same thing in message environments. We know that messages are directed at different populations in different ways, and we need to be sensitive to and aware of the way in which marketing occurs in these different neighborhoods. We also need to be aware of, especially in places where it isn't safe to go out or there is not the opportunity because there's no adult supervision or no transportation, the variations, I should say, in the ways in which different populations utilize television, utilize other media, and think about how we respond as we're trying to attempt equity for all of our population. Which leads to this basic notion that it's time for a call to action. It was time last May when the report was issued. It's time today. We believe at the core that this is a national epidemic with the effects that we have described, and it requires large-scale transformative approaches focused in a multi-level way through interconnected systems, as we discussed, if we're going to not just reduce the threat of obesity, but in the end eliminate the obesity epidemic in this country. This is different from the other reports and different from the other recommendations. The report itself focuses on everybody, and the report is very clear that everybody's involved. I think it is undoubtedly the case in public health, but certainly broadly. We would all love, when we see a problem, and I'll speak for myself on the public sector side, when we see a problem, we want to solve it. We want it to end. And what would really be great is if there was one thing we could do, if there was that wonderful silver bullet that we could fire, like the Salk vaccine, or some might argue fluoridation, that thing that transforms the whole sector. What's very, very, back up. When we started, I'm sure each of us hoped in a way that we could go through the 800 recommendations, sort them in a fashion that would provide, and as many on the committee would have liked, others outside. What are the top 5? Yeah. Give me 3. Tell me the 2 things I should do tonight. It's such it's just how we are, right? Well, okay, if I can't do anything else, tell me the one thing I should do, at least right now, to change the world. And the answer at the beginning of this discussion is that we all have this role, and all of these things are important. All of these things contributed to where we are, and in the end, we're going to have to do as much, if not all of them, if we're going to reverse it, and it is an urgent need to act now, to mobilize in ways that we haven't mobilized before, and stay clear about the way in which we have to collaborate to make these things successful. This is a representation that's so simple even a former mayor can understand it, and I think it is within the materials that you have, and it presents all 5 of these recommendations together. Schools sit at the heart, but no one in this room will leave believing that that makes schools the boss of it, or responsible for it, or accountable for it by themselves. Everyone on that page is involved, and everyone on that page has to be involved, and it's going to be sustained. It's going to be something that we all do, and we do need to do it all. It is going to be something we hope and believe that we will do now, and it will be all of us. And I will say, it's not in the report this way, but in my opinion, it's forever. There are other kinds of public health challenges that we just take care of, and it goes away. This is a public health challenge that will always require our attention and our vigilance. And as long as we recognize that going in, I think, then there will be no false expectations. Leaders want that the year of the child. I don't know how many years of the child I've announced or been through, at least 3. And they always begin the same way. You know, we focus on the bad numbers. Sometimes if we're particularly visual, we might have some children who look sad, weak, unhappy, skinny, troubled. And then at the end of the year, invariably, we announce a success of the year of the child. It went very well. Look, the children are looking better. They're taller and seem to be better, filling out well. Their clothes are cleaner. They're happier. Look, they're smiling now. It was a good year of the child. We move on to the year of the senior and the year of the turtle, the year of the chicken, the year of something else. We move on. And when we move on in problems like this, invariably, we fall back. And so I think as we move into this commitment, it is critical that particularly public officials understand, actually, there are things we're going to do, and we're going to do them now, and I just need to tell you we're just going to do them forever, okay? And as long as we know it's forever, then there will be no temptation. We can celebrate milestones, we can celebrate success, we can celebrate the fact that we've plateaued, maybe that we're now beginning to decline, but ultimately, even when we get back where we started, we won't be celebrating the end of the campaign. We'll just be celebrating the fact that we have succeeded beyond the wildest dreams of many in this country, hopefully none in this room. In a recent listing of America's healthiest cities, No question that it was subjective in many ways. It comes out, these things come out all of the time, but the most recent one was by, it came out in Forbes, and it was the American College of Sports Medicine. Minneapolis led as the healthiest city in their view, in their subjective analysis. Boston was on that list of healthiest cities. San Diego, Portland. Would you be surprised if I told you Richmond, Virginia, or Virginia Beach? Tampa was not on that list. Nashville, Tennessee was not on that list. But I will tell you that I want to be. As a Nashvilleian, I want my city on that list. And why wouldn't you aspire to be the healthiest city in America? In the old days, 100 years ago, sometimes less, successful cities had, the Erie Canal, Great Lakes, railroads, coal, oil, resources, not bad things to have, outstanding, wonderful beaches, great things to have, great draws, and great reasons that hold people there. But successful cities now, and I think we heard this from the mayor, are most dependent on people. That's what's most important. That's our major resource now. And people want to be where education is good and improving, where safety is good and improving, and where quality of life is good and improving, and the people in this room know better than anybody else that quality of life is dependent on good health. So I would say, not as the vice chairman of this committee, but more as a former mayor who was brought here today to talk from that perspective as well, that if you decide you want to be the healthiest city in America, people will know that you're not there yet. But they will come to understand that you aspire to be, that it's what you want to be. And in implementing these recommendations, I do believe the committee would support the notion you got to start out. Do what you can do now. Don't be distracted by the things that you personally can't do, or for whatever reason your community doesn't have the resources at this moment to do. You do those things you can do now and come back later, circle back around to those things that you had to bypass. Become a magnet for those who need your health care and your health resources and your good health, and you'll be a magnet for their spouses and their children and their grandchildren. And I'd suggest that you do it because you want to be that place. You do it because you can't afford not to be that place. You do it because mostly these are things you already wanted to do, and that is maybe, it can be our secret, that I know that most of these things are things that people in public health wanted to do. The people at the YMCA had a strong feeling about wanting to do these things. That's okay. You don't have to say, I always wanted to do it. I've been waiting for this moment. Finally, the science caught up with the things that you believed we should do, and now there is this strong recommendation to do all of those things. You'll do it for your own children and your own grandchildren. Or maybe you do it because it's Lent. You know, Lent isn't just about giving up things, at least not, and I'm a Baptist who married a Methodist, and after about 7 years we compromised and I became a Methodist. So I am a more recent convert to the notion of Lent, but just without being proselytizing, I promise I'm not being about that. A piece of it is not just giving up things, but also the notion of doing good deeds, of reparations and repairing things in the world. And so it's a particularly good time to think about all the things you've always wanted to do and always needed to do. You can focus on it from a scientific standpoint. I can take you back to a couple of thousand years, actually, to Ecclesiastes, where the 4th chapter, the 13th verse, it's written, "Better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king who will not be admonished." For a long time, we didn't have an admonition. We didn't know what to do. Now we know what to do. And those words are particularly clear and straightforward. But I can take you more recently to Carl Jung, who observed that the little world of childhood is a model of the greater world, and then went on to say, if there's anything that we wish to change in the child, we should first examine it and see whether it is not something that could be better changed in ourselves. And so we focus on our children today, but we also focus on ourselves and our community and our world, believing that we've come a long and dangerous path. But with this report, and mostly with the commitment of the people in this room, professionally for so long, that we are within reach of making this the world that we wanted it to be and that we always intended it to be for our children. That would be my hope. Thank you so much for allowing both Ellen and me to be here with you, and we look forward to your great progress today and in the months and years ahead.
Wow, that was terrific. Thanks to both of you. Absolutely fabulous. We do have time for questions, and I'm sure you have some. I will say, though, the secret to getting kids to eat anything is to put Parmesan cheese on it.
So you're okay on pizza?
Oh, well, the pizza thing, I almost had a heart attack. But I think it's interesting, and again, I think your comment about what we grew up with and what we therefore know. And when you talked about pizza, and I thought, why am I having this reaction? I think pizza's become the new comfort food.
Yes, I think it is.
When I was a kid and you were down, Mom would make a tuna
I think
casserole.
you're right. I think you're right.
I haven't made a tuna casserole ever in my life, but I can dial the pizza number.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I really do want to thank you. This was an incredibly thorough report of what was clearly a robust committee process to consider all of these things, and some of the themes I'll just want to echo while you're all formulating your questions, that there are 5 goals here, but they don't exist in isolation. They are all interrelated, and we must approach them in a systematic, integrative way. Thank you for making that point. I made a note early on, but you answered my question. I think I have a concern, I'll say, about this notion of evidence-based practice means you can implement it and walk away, and that's not at all true. We have to constantly be studying and examining and researching how the evidence applies in the situation that we're in. Absolutely. And how the evidence changes as circumstances change around us. So thank you for reinforcing the notion that we don't get a pass on the continued evaluation, monitoring, study of how these things are working in our communities. The other thing that I think is always interesting about food, and something that makes it so challenging, I think, and you mentioned tobacco, and we often think about tobacco and how we approach tobacco. Tobacco is not something anyone needs to live.
That's right.
There are people who are we're very sorry, hopelessly addicted to tobacco. That's true. But tobacco can be put out there as an evil. We can have labeling that is grotesque. We can't do that with food. We all need food. And so it's a matter of, you can't say don't eat food. You have to say don't eat that food or eat this food or be positive. So it's always an interesting parallel. And I remember being a young master's graduate. I was working for the Maryland Department of Health, and we were going to the legislature to get their approval for some smoking programs. This is in 82 or something. And I remember a member of the legislature said, I know what you're up to. I know exactly what you're up to. You're here talking about tobacco today, and you're going to be back talking about pork chops tomorrow, and I'm not having any of it. And I thought, gosh, he's right. How did he know? How did he know? And the point about, again, it's system, it's integrated, it all feeds off each other, and particularly the messaging and the marketing and all of that having to surround this, because whatever we say in the different institutions and the different organizations and the different settings has to be reinforced with the messages, the constant messages, I think is very, very important. And yes, we know social marketing campaigns can work, but they're not a panacea. But I think also how we educate our children, how we educate new mothers, and I'll tell one more funny story and then I'll let people ask questions. I was at something that the mayor had sponsored. It was actually the previous mayor, Pam Iorio. And it was a fitness diet effort, and I don't remember where this woman worked, but she had lost a lot of weight, so she was up there talking about how she had done this, and she said she'd gone down to the vending area in the afternoon. You get that low, and she went to buy a candy bar, and lo and behold, that little twisty thing spit out 2 candy bars. Yes. So she's walking upstairs, and she's thinking, you know what? I don't need 2 candy bars. I really need to. So her coworker. She says, hey, look, the machine spit out 2 candy bars. Would you like the candy bar? And her coworker says, sure, thanks, that's really great, and opens the drawer and puts it in the drawer. Who puts a candy bar in a drawer? She was amazed. She said, I had never seen anyone take a candy bar and put it in a drawer. She says, but it gets better. A week or so later, she said, phone rang, she couldn't find a pen. So she opens her coworker's drawer. And there's that candy bar with 1 bite taken out of it. It's carefully folded over. And she said it was like someone had hit me upside the head. I didn't know you could have one bite of a candy bar and put the rest back. So, I mean, all these messages and how we support each other at the individual level, as family to family, as community to community, all incredibly important. And then, I lied, I have one more story. I went to a very large high school. There were over 3,000 students, and it was a big footprint. The campus was huge, and there was only one wing that had an upstairs, so most everything was on the first floor. And invariably, you'd get your schedule at the beginning of the year. And you'd see that your first class was in this corner, and the second was over in this corner, and the third was over here, and then you had to go upstairs, and then you had to come down, and your locker was who knows where. We had 8 minutes between classes. That's how big the building was. I'm thinking, 8 minutes between classes, 8 periods, 64 minutes. I got my 60 minutes.